In the world's film capital is the studio that stands as a monument to the great genius of Walt Disney, master of a new form of popular art that has captivated millions of moviegoers.
It has something that you don't have, Max. It has a philosophy, and that is what makes it dangerous.
Where are you from?
Disneyland.
Who's the leader of the club that's made for you and me? M-I-C-K-E-Y, M-O-U-S-E. Hey there, hi there, ho there, you're as welcome as can be. M-I-C-K-E-Y, M-O-U-S-E, Mickey Mouse.
The Disney World Order began with the international power of film. In the post-war period, they annexed the American home. By the 90s, their cultural domination reached unprecedented heights as they became a multimedia conglomerate. It could only have happened in that little historical epoch between the creation of home video and before the proliferation of the internet, fractured and decentralized mass media. Gaming, YouTube, anime, even just the culture of memes and message boards have all provided competition for kids' attentions, which didn't exist in the analog media days. Disney's power comes from the time when mass culture was disseminated entirely from the top down, like a dictatorship. And while they now control more territory than ever, they're not at the vanguard of anything anymore. Their power is almost entirely institutional. Disney Plus definitely holds the same place in American households that the big pile of Disney clamshell videos once did. They've had to maintain their status through the continual recycling of their old library and the continual acquisition of more and more intellectual property. In 2012, they bought Marvel. In 2019, Lucasfilm, and 21st Century Fox the same year. These recent acquisitions are a bit different from when they staked their claim on classic fairy tales and children's literature. Because, with all due respect to Star Wars, it's not like Star Wars is some sacred thing. But to give credit where it's due, I think whatever made Star Wars special to people over the years was the result of it having some creative integrity. For a long time, it reflected the vision of its creator, for better or worse. After Disney acquired it, it went through a lot of the changes we associate with Disneyfication. However, the process of something being diluted into the Disney version of itself is now a much more insidious one than it used to be. It's not just about sanitization. There's also a modern philosophical framework which every acquired property gets brought up to compliance with, like a mandatory ethical training module from a human resources department. Even their old IPs have to be re-assimilated. The rash of live-action remakes isn't just about Disney strip-mining its own catalog, it's also about them wanting an almost 90-year-old film like Snow White to be brought up to date with the company's current values. Even the remake of a relatively newer film, like Lilo and Stitch from 2002, had to have a lot of changes made to it because, yeah, just 2 decades later, the current stewards of Disney have different ideas about what the values of the American public should be. And they take their position of authority very seriously. Before Disney bought Star Wars, you could be sure that the franchise reflected the interests and beliefs of George Lucas, but whose does it reflect now? The new Star Wars shows and films absolutely reflect some sense of morality, but it's not any one person's. It's an institutional morality, the morality of the status quo. If Disney is the unofficial Ministry of Culture for America, and America is the dominant military and economic power of the world, what does that make Disney? Would it interest you to know that at the time of this recording, the chief creative officer of the Walt Disney Company, Jared Bush, is a man whose father and grandfather worked for the CIA? What kind of values was he raised with? This man wrote many of Disney's most popular films over the past decades. Why are we entrusting people like him with the minds of millions of kids? You have to ask these questions because, really, the stories we tell kids are what teach them the values they hold as adults. And what do adults who have been raised on Disney values look like? Well, with millennials who grew up in the 90s under peak Disney, the ultimate Disneyfication victims, I think we have our answer. Disney's acquisition of Star Wars and Marvel are interesting in this light because Disney bought them hoping to widen their audience to young boys, but both of those media franchises kind of had bad reputations. The proverbial figures of the Star Wars geek or the Marvel Comics nerd have been around for a long time, but after Disney purchased Lucasfilm and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, suddenly you didn't see nearly as much mockery in the media towards young men for being fans of these things as adults. It was like the memo went out. Star Wars and Marvel were respectable now because they were under Disney's protection. People talk about the rise of geek culture in the 2000s, but I think that's kind of missing the big picture. The real story is the rise of immaturity, and the relationship that millennials have to pop culture is only a part of that. As with the decline of cultural literacy, Disney might not have been responsible for this, but they certainly benefit from it. They're not just selling their products to children or parents anymore, they have a strong financial incentive to erase the line between children's entertainment and adult entertainment. And over the past 25 years, they have successfully redefined themselves as entertainment for adults, with millennials as their most loyal customers. Disney stole your childhood, sure, but with my generation, the company's vision for children's culture became the vision for all culture. And that's when they started stealing people's adulthoods as well. I think this era began for them in 2003 with the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, because here was a movie based on one of the most famous rides at Disneyland, and it wasn't intended primarily for children. It was the first Disney film with a PG-13 rating that was released under the Disney name, rather than going through one of their subsidiaries. I remember being shocked as a high schooler that my other teenage friends wanted to go see it, because I was like, you guys want to go see a Disney movie? So the stigma of Disney movies being just for little kids was on its way out. And the biggest factor in that change was Pixar, because a year after that first Pirates film came out, you also had the release of The Incredibles, and even more than other Pixar films which preceded that one, this was the first time I remember hearing a lot of people say, "Oh, it's so good, you can enjoy it even if you're an adult. You don't even have to have kids to go see it." Well, as it turned out, a lot of millennials decided that they didn't ever need to have kids to enjoy kids' stuff. They were going to remain loyal to the first name and family entertainment, even without families of their own. The biggest reason we have Disney adults now is because millennials were the first generation to have an unbroken continuity of watching Disney stuff as kids to watching Disney stuff as young adults. Now, as a grown man who appreciates comics and animation, I'm pretty familiar with the justifications that people make when they get put on the spot about reading, or more likely watching, things intended for kids. Usually it's a kind of circular logic about how if they're an adult and they're enjoying something, then ipso facto, it's also for adults as well as children. And at this point, many of the creators of children's entertainment are well aware of these young adult and fully grown adult fans. In fact, once millennials reached Hollywood, many of them just outright began creating shows that were nominally for kids, but also intended for adolescents, and emotionally immature teenagers, and emotionally immature adults like themselves. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Disney Channel in particular has become home to a lot of what you might call YA cartoons, YA being the marketing term that the publishing industry came up with for young adults. And yeah, there's plenty of adults out there who are reading YA novels too. The feedback loop of all of this is that when young adults are consuming stuff intended primarily for kids, the stuff that should be for kids becomes more adult in nature, but not in a mature way because they're catering towards these fandoms of young adults who are themselves immature. So what you end up with is a lot of pop culture that's not sophisticated enough to be for adults only, but it's also too self-aware to be truly enchanting for kids. It's this weird middle ground that's simultaneously too naive and too cynical, too mature and not mature enough. And Disney has really mastered how to produce that kind of entertainment. More than ever, their brand has become a kind of one-size-fits-all vision for a universal common culture for all ages and all peoples of an infantilized public. The phrase Disney adult is a provocative term because that type of person has become common enough to be recognized, but Disney adult is actually a very broad category now when you consider everything they own. A lot of people are technically Disney adults by association. The Simpsons, arguably the most popular TV show of all time, the cartoon most beloved by millennials, which the oldest of us grew up with in real time, this fictional family, which so many formed a parasocial relationship with, they too are now part of Disney's all-encompassing corporate family. More than any other generation, millennials were raised by pop culture, so the values of millennials, whether they're Disney adults or not, are more or less the values of the modern Walt Disney Company, because Disney has either produced or acquired more of that pop culture than anyone. The question then is, what kind of worldview did Disney imprint on them? Did any of those Disney Channel sitcoms, which became so popular in the 2000s, did they teach them any universal truths? I know it's trite to point out that entertainment is not reality, and I'm not exactly breaking new ground in media studies by pointing out that kids are particularly vulnerable to getting a distorted worldview from Hollywood. But because the name of Disney is so sacrosanct in America, people have a blind spot about how much power they hold, while simultaneously giving them more influence over kids than any other brand of media. The Disney name is trusted to stand for entertainment that will be appropriate for kids by not having too much sex or violence. But they're also assumed to have good morals and messages, even though that's a far more complex matter. And people have assumed this for decades and decades, even though, obviously, society has changed a lot since the Walt Disney Company was founded in 1923. So in terms of what Disney really stands for and what they teach kids about the world, what has stayed the same over the past century? Well, we know the lessons you get from Disney fairy tales or ABC sitcoms aren't as harsh as what you'd find outside of the Disney worldview. Because no matter what year it is, the Disney version of reality is commonly understood to be an idealized fantasy. But ideals are what shape people's lives, especially in childhood. When you grow up and the world around you becomes less easy to understand, who hasn't sometimes wished that things could be as simple as they are in a Disney movie? Disney has provided this emotional release for a long time, like the rest of Hollywood. In the 1930s, their colorful musical cartoons were an escape from the grim realities of the Great Depression. Mickey Mouse's cheerful, can-do attitude was a huge part of his popularity. The most consistent message of Disney cartoons, and later Disney films, was that if you keep your chin up, everything will turn out all right. That's the number one thing that's never changed about Disney, the reassurance. I believe this is a big part of why their signature art style emphasized a kind of generic cuteness. And even in Walt's day, there were serious critics who took shots at him for this, the contradictory combination of lofty artistic aspirations with plain artistic tastes. And in the decades following his death, more and more people in mainstream media, especially comedians, would mock Disney and use the word Disney to mean something corny and watered down for children. As the company's size and reach expanded, you could also see them trying to redefine themselves. They knew the company's image was too squeaky clean, and their reputation was too conservative, too old-fashioned. I mentioned how, starting with films like Aladdin, Disney's humor became just a bit more ironic and self-aware because that was the tone of the times.
It's a small world after all.
No, anything but that.
They didn't want Disney to be thought of as unhip or out of touch anymore. They wanted Disney to be thought of as cool. They even had their own version of Ren and Stimpy. You don't see much mockery of Disney in the mainstream media anymore, and yeah, that's partly because they're considered hipper than they used to be, but the main reason is they just own so much of the mainstream media now.
Tim Allen gives that same likable performance we always love, once again proving Disney pictures have the magic touch that may not win awards, but keep America smiling. How is that?
You're Satan, aren't you?
You win another round, Cisco.
The last time Disney parodies were commonplace probably was the 2000s, and on an everyday level, they occupy such a venerated place in our culture that for most adults, not even Disney adults per se, making fun of Disney is like making fun of their religion, because the company is inseparable from their childhoods and consequently from their desire to give their own kids a happy childhood. There's not a lot of cultural traditions being passed on in America anymore, but Disney still provides some kind of continuity from one generation to the next. And the company very consciously positioned themselves this way. The biggest enforcers of this social consensus are Walt's old reliables, his strongest soldiers, the moms. But the difference between when Walt said that back in 1959 and what that means today is that when The Little Mermaid was released in 1989, Disney finally realized that their real customer base wasn't children in general, but little girls in particular. And with the advent of the tween marketing demographic, referring to that period between childhoods and older teenage years, which covers preteen and adolescent girls, Disney has figured out how to keep girls interested in all things Disney for as long as humanly possible. From princesses and cute animals to sitcoms and pop stars, Disney has never really been for the boys as much as the girls. Disney adulthood is primarily a female phenomenon. I think The Little Mermaid is where the modern era of Disney begins because Ariel was very much the prototypical Disney princess for millennial girls. She was modern in a way that was distinct from previous Disney girls. They hadn't even used a teen girl protagonist since 1959, and Sleeping Beauty was an old-fashioned girl even back then. The contemporary sensibility which Ariel embodied was as upfront as her bare midriff. Her story is one of self-actualization, but she has much more aggression and agency about it than Cinderella or Snow White. There's no wicked step-parents here. Her whole journey is basically about wanting to leave home because she's such a strong-willed young woman. The Little Mermaid is almost 40 years old now, and Disney girls have only gotten sassier and spunkier since then, not to mention better at hand-to-hand combat. The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast actually seem kind of old-fashioned now in that they're still traditional love stories rather than stories about a young heroine going out on some kind of quest. With the creation of the Disney Princess brand, the company started speaking to girls directly. And not long after that, once millennial girls started feeling too old for cartoons, Disney began creating a plethora of live-action entertainment, including Disney brand pop stars. Disney might not have invented the marketing demographic of tweens, but they pretty much perfected how to exploit it as far as girls were concerned. Since Disney was no longer something little girls were expected to grow out of so much, the Disney version of girlhood and even young adulthood was now something aspirational for girls to grow up into. And unfortunately, when you look at the kind of young girl characters on the Disney Channel whom little girls have to look up to as role models, they tend to be pretty catty. When you look at the lifestyle of a typical Disney Channel sitcom teenager that's being glamorized, it's a pretty materialistic and self-serving one, despite pretensions to vaguely defined higher ideals like family and friendship. This idealized Disney version of adolescence and teenage life, it's like crack cocaine to little girls. It's an extremely seductive fantasy because it presents a world where everything revolves around them. Conversely, is there anything Disney really has to offer young boys besides the Marvel and the Star Wars franchises they acquired? Their catalog is littered with adaptations from the canon of boyhood literature and culture. The Jungle Book, Hercules, Tarzan, Treasure Island in Space, but The rough edges of those adventures always get smoothed out just as much as they do for any fairy tale. And like all Disney films, the tone is modified to be inoffensive to moms. So even in the grandest of adventure stories, nothing's ever allowed to be too serious for too long. And that makes it harder for boys to get into, because boys like it when the stakes in a story feel real and actions have consequences, and the hero's journey, for lack of a better term, is taken dead seriously. I think this is one of the big reasons why anime has become so popular for young boys in America, now that it's readily available as an alternative. Because while Disney films might be amusing for boys in early childhood, it doesn't take long for something like Dragon Ball Z to speak to them more. The youngest millennials are pushing 30 now, so where does the first name and family entertainment fit in for those who don't have families? For Disney adults, I think the fandom becomes their family on some level. And to throw my fellow millennials under the bus some more here, I think being raised so heavily on modern Disney values might have something to do with our reputation for being too soft, too emotionally immature, and, after the financial crash of 2008, for our thwarted sense of entitlement. Maybe Disney adulthood is partly a kind of mass trauma response. Some people think there's inherently fascist undercurrents to indulging in childhood nostalgia, the theory being that if you tell people their happy childhoods are proof that something has been stolen from them, you can make them demand political action to return to it. Disney, as usual, is conveniently left out of these arguments, but if you're talking about weaponized nostalgia, what other company has engaged in such industrial-scale production of childhood memories? Long before millennials, nostalgia was always part of the Disney brand. Walt's childhood determined what a lot of the stories were that he adapted. Literally, the first thing you do at Disneyland is walk through an idealized recreation of where he grew up at the turn of the century. The 2013 video game BioShock Infinite is partially a satire of this Main Street USA fantasy, and the fact it's revealed to be a dystopia might be where some people got the idea that all nostalgia has a fascist subtext. But the Disney conception of childhood, and now even adolescence, is so idealized it can't help but inspire fanatical devotion, especially from only children and children of divorce, two categories that are certainly well represented among millennials. I say this with sympathy. There's a lot of adults out there right now who are either confused or embittered that real life is not like the Disney movies or TV shows they grew up with, even if they know, objectively, that that's a foolish thing to yearn for. Because Disney made it so easy to remain in that Disneyland fantasy long after childhood. And just as that's not going to end with the millennials, the effects of society-wide arrested development are going to continue to be felt by everyone. An infantilized public is a more helpless and easily manipulated public. Nostalgia might not be inherently fascist, but to deny any political implications of a Disney-dominated culture is just naive, especially when the company is so self-conscious and frankly self-important about their role in shaping millions of people's lives. Walt himself was no stranger to propaganda. Consider that in World War II, the American State Department actually commissioned him to go on goodwill tours of Central and South America. They also co-funded 2 Disney films with the goal of strengthening ties with Latin America. A decade later, Walt was promoting the U.S. space program on the wonderful world of Disney. He was very much happy that his company, his name, and he himself could be so synonymous with America. He certainly believed in the post-war dream that America could unify the entire world as the guiding light of democracy and free enterprise. He expressed his faith in this dream in his own cornball Disney ways through projects like the It's a Small World ride, which debuted at the 1964 World's Fair, and in his plans for EPCOT Center, which included a kind of permanent World's Fair pavilion of different countries. Walt had utopian ideals about America's place in the world, like most Americans at the time. But unlike most Americans, he actually was in a position to shape that vision in the popular consciousness. He would have loved the 90s because history repeated itself after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Part of the reason his company thrived more than ever in that decade was that America's position as the center of global affairs seemed more indomitable than ever. The dream of a small world after all seemed to be coming true, including the notion that any ethnic conflicts could be pacified under the dominion of American culture, which Disney was synonymous with. I'm barely exaggerating because this was a time when political pundits were making insane statements like, "No two countries that both have a McDonald's have ever fought a war against each other." In the wake of the Cold War ending, another concept which really caught on in the 90s was that of multiculturalism, and Disney began pursuing its own version of that. It's not a big leap from "It's a Small World After All" to the idea of being a world citizen. Disney prides themselves on being able to adapt any culture into their brand, at least for an American audience. But the American audience is also the template for the global audience. Disney believes that just as America is an idea which everyone can become a part of, all peoples can be represented by Disney. It's through Disney that the corporate ideal of global culture finds its ultimate expression. Of course, this is not without its contradictions. At the same time that Disney was making Mulan, their version of a Chinese folk legend, their films and TV shows were temporarily being banned in China in retaliation for distributing the film Kundun, which was Martin Scorsese's biopic of the Dalai Lama. The president of Disney had to apologize to the Chinese Communist Party just to open up the Chinese market again. Disney has to operate according to a kind of idealistic cynicism, or cynical idealism, where they want to make entertainment that will unite the entire world, but without ever offending anyone. When you think about this balancing act, the overlap between the US State Department and the Walt Disney Company starts to feel a lot more natural. In the first half of Disney's existence, it's easy to look at their catalog and see what got cut out or toned down from the classic stories or fairy tales they adapted. In the second half of their history, which we're still living in, their relationship to culture is far more complex because it's literally a matter of international policy. Their productions are no longer so Eurocentric, as academics like to say, but they're also no longer so concerned with the American mythology that meant so much to Walt. Disney is now in the strange position of still being a symbol of America, if not the symbol of America, but also representing post-American, post-national values. They're not just teaching kids a particular worldview for their day-to-day life, but also how to view the rest of the world and their place in it. In the past, working for Disney would have already carried a huge sense of social responsibility because you knew you were making stuff that was going to be seen by millions of kids across America. It's a little hard to imagine the sense of scale that people at Disney must feel bearing down on them now, knowing they're expected to make entertainment that will be seen by virtually every kid on the planet. Besides all the morals and messages that Disney globalism imparts to kids, what effects does it have on their imaginations when it comes to foreign cultures? I think when a child's first impressions of a foreign culture come to them through a Disney filter, the kids get robbed of any natural wonder they might have developed about them. Because Disneyfication is a universal solvent that reassures kids all cultures are basically the same if they can be made to fit within the confines of a Disney movie. The excitement of being exposed to stories, art, music, and so on from other countries comes from how different they are to your own. But the multicultural ideology which Disney ascribes to insists that ethnic differences are basically superficial, because they can still be plugged into all the Disney movie formulas we're familiar with. Nothing can ever be too otherworldly to fit into the wonderful world of Disney. It's a kind of Pax Americana where every ethnicity on Earth gets to be enfranchised by having their own Disney version. I titled this video How Disney Stole Your Childhood, but that's putting it mildly because when someone steals your childhood, they really steal your whole understanding of the world and even of yourself. Disney went from a studio that made animated shorts and films to making live-action films and television, to a theme park empire, to the largest multimedia conglomerate in the world. This empire was founded on the treasures of the past, and now it stays alive through cultural imperialism. We've all grown up with Disney to some degree, but so many have spent their whole lives in the shadow of the empire. The psychic mindscape of their childhoods was colonized, occupied, and conquered as part of the greater Magic Kingdom. If imagination is at the center of our cultural landscape, that land has lost its sovereignty. Mermaids, genies, pirates, princesses, and even all the different cultures of the world are commonly introduced to kids in a proprietary way through Disney. And how many fantastical concepts or ancient motifs like transformation, ancestral memory, or even true love are filtered through Disney when they first reach a child. The essential truth about storytelling is it's never just mere entertainment. You're always having a view of the world imparted on you, whether it's deep and meaningful or shallow and stupid, which makes storytelling for children nothing less than sacred. Kids are ravenous for stories because they're ravenous to learn about the world. If the most important storyteller in their life is an entertainment conglomerate, and every classic story they know is a part of that same corporate franchise, that company becomes like a nanny who the kid starts to trust more than their actual parents. The problem with Disney storytelling is that after they've plundered the riches of the world's imaginarium, all the myths, fables, legends, and literature, they homogenize them. When Walt was around, he at least paid due respect to the source material, but that was a long time ago. We're in a post-literate society now, one where Americans have lost touch with their history and reject the idea of high culture entirely. People still want a shared culture, but they have a hard time imagining raising their kids without outsourcing all that storytelling to this international government-backed institution. We presume this corporate empire has moral, political, and philosophical neutrality, but what have all these Disney versions really been teaching us? At least with Walt, you could boil that down to what one man believed in. Does the Walt Disney Company merely maintain society's status quo, or have they come to consider themselves the ongoing arbiters of how children should be raised? Disney-branded childhoods become Disney-branded adulthoods, become Disney-branded reality. The inspiration for this video was my realization that the ubiquitousness of Disney actually posed a threat not just to the connections I was making with my own kids, but also their ability to dream their own dreams. I mentioned how one of my daughter's favorite stories is Rapunzel, and Rapunzel was the story that made me see this. Because when I started experiencing the joy of reading to her, it occurred to me that if her first exposure to that classic fairy tale was the Disney version, that was going to be the main version in her mind forever. Rapunzel would be just another member of the Disney princess clique that she'd see on backpacks at Walmart and on t-shirts at the playground and wherever else. When she wanted to play it at home, she'd want to play a version of Rapunzel with snarky humor and animal sidekicks and all kinds of other Hollywood nonsense. Not to mention a Rapunzel who gets reunited with her parents at the end, as if that's the point of the story. I'm glad that in her mind, in her imagination, Rapunzel's voice is her voice, not some voice actress. Bill Watterson, the author of the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, once wrote something about this regarding his refusal to license his characters for animation or even merchandise. He said, "The world of a comic strip ought to be a special place with its own logic and life. I don't want some animation studio giving Hobbes an actor's voice. The world of a comic strip is much more fragile than most people realize or will admit. When a cartoonist licenses his characters, his voice is co-opted by the business concerns of toy makers, television producers, and advertisers. This could be said about the integrity of any artistic work, but particularly of works for children, where the author carries a greater responsibility to protect the integrity of the enchantment they're trying to create. A lot of authors' voices have been co-opted by culture merchants like the Walt Disney Company, mostly long after they were dead, so it's not as though they had a say in it. Regardless of the accomplishments Disney's had in the past, why do people still look to them as a font of creativity? Largely it's because that's what they've always told us they are. The 20th century, the century of Disney's ascendancy, was also the century when advertising, public relations, and propaganda as we know them were created. Walt might not have allowed any geniuses at his studio, but he never showed any modesty when it came to being called one, whether by the press or in his own publicity materials. The history of American animation was practically written by Disney's marketing department.
What do you read?
It's a biography on Walt Disney. It's fascinating. He's a genius, you know. I mean a once in every 50 or 100 years kind of genius.
What are you, 12?
And decade after decade, they continue to self-mythologize and self-aggrandize. Walt is depicted as nothing less than the greatest storyteller in the history of Western civilization. Their new stuff might not be as popular now that they have to compete for kids' attentions with the internet and video games, anime, etc., but their vast library of content, which they built on the backs of the classics, has unquestionably enshrined them as a permanent institution of American life. They made the Disney brand synonymous with the idea of childhood itself, and there can be no greater triumph of corporate will. There is a mouse inside your head. You must exterminate it. I don't mean you should try to deny the existence of Disney, because how could you? And yeah, a lot of their old films are good, sometimes even great movies for kids. If you appreciate animation, it's some of the most technically accomplished stuff you'll ever see. And really, it's fine for kids to enjoy the Disney versions of things sometimes. My favorite Disney film as a kid was The Jungle Book, which is a pretty far cry from the original story. But the point is, it's not like the Disney Jungle Book has kept kids reading the Kipling book. You need a literate society with a baseline cultural canon for that, and we don't have those anymore. We've lost the context. If you introduced kids to the original works first, wherever possible, they'll at least understand that the Disney version of any classic story is just that. It's only a movie. Those characters and stories don't really belong to Disney. They belong to them. Your kids. You'll be stopping that mouse from burrowing into their heads permanently at a young age. When I was a very young kid, I went through an intense phase of being obsessed with Peter Pan. And the first version of the character and the story I ever saw was a 1960 TV broadcast of the 1954 Broadway musical. That musical version sticks pretty close to the original story and stage play by James Barry. My parents brought home the big clamshell VHS tape of it, and it's probably my first memory of watching anything because I vividly remember feeling like our TV was literally a magic window into another world. Because I loved it so much, at some point not long afterwards, my parents also brought home the clamshell VHS of the Disney film, which had just been released on home video for the first time. And I liked it, sure, but even as a 4-year-old, I just knew that the Disney version didn't have as much going on. Both versions told the same basic story, and the Disney version had a few songs of its own too, but even though I couldn't have articulated it at the time, I could tell that it was a simpler, less sophisticated, less dramatic, and overall more syrupy sweet version of what I'd seen already. If the Disney version had been the first one I'd seen, I don't think Peter Pan would have been a significant part of my childhood imagination. It would have just been another Disney film. Peter Pan has been in the public domain for a long time, so according to the law, he belongs to everyone, and it's Disney's right as much as anyone's to create their own version of him. But when we passively allow Disney's version to be the primary version, we collude in their cultural monopoly. To paraphrase The Last Psychiatrist, Disney didn't just teach us what to want, but how to want. We surrendered our childhood imaginations to them, and millions of people are trying to buy back those special feelings as adults, and/or to buy them for their own kids, continuing the cycle. But kids deserve a real masterpiece collection, not just the Disney versions. They deserve real magic in their young lives, not just the corporate brand of Disney magic. Storytelling is magic, and every story counts, especially during childhood. So, what vision of the world will you give your kids? Disney World, or the world of pure imagination?
Can you remember the way it used to feel when you believed in make-believe and fairy tales were real? It's like a dream come true, but still inside of you.
Come be a part of Disney World's 25th anniversary.
It's time to remember the magic.
On my right is Mickey Mouse, to my right is Minnie Mouse, and we all go little place in Disneyland, California. Mickey!